Let's start with the question everybody's asking. Is affirmative action over? Like, actually over? If the Supreme Court banned race-based admissions, are law schools still using race in admissions behind the scenes? The short answer is, it's complicated. The long answer is, it's really complicated, and if you're applying to law school, it affects you whether you realize it or not. And I don't mean if you just check a certain box, I mean everybody. It affects your chances of getting in, how much money you get offered, what your essays are really saying to admissions, and even which schools people suggest are a good fit for you. All of that has shifted, and yet, not really. So today, let's talk about what's really going on in law school admissions post-affirmative action. And this is not going to be a political rant. I'm not here to tell you what should happen. I'm here to explain what is happening so that you don't get blindsided. Let's start with the headline. Back in 2023, the Supreme Court officially struck down race-based affirmative action in college and graduate school admissions. The case was Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, and the decision was clear. Colleges and grad schools, including law schools, can no longer consider race as a factor in admissions. Chief Justice Roberts wrote, "Eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it." So, there it is, end of the road, no more race boxes, no more underrepresented minority preferences, no more admission officers scanning for demographic balance, right? Well, if you've ever met a lawyer, you know the answer. There is always a footnote, a nuance, a however. Because here's the truth. While race can no longer be used explicitly, the goals behind affirmative action have not disappeared. The pressures haven't disappeared, and the incentives definitely haven't disappeared. And when those things are still in play, you better believe schools are going to look for ways to hit their numbers without crossing a legal line. That's why it's not enough to just know what the court ruled. You've got to understand how schools interpret it, how they're adapting, and how those adaptations affect you. Because in real life, this ruling doesn't live in a vacuum. It lives inside admissions offices, with actual humans under actual pressure trying to meet conflicting demands. Here's what I mean. On the one hand, schools are terrified of getting sued for using race. On the other hand, they're terrified of getting flagged by their accreditor, the American Bar Association, for not having enough racial diversity. On the third hand, and yeah, we're giving them a third hand here, their PR teams want to be able to tweet glowing headlines about their most diverse class ever. It is a mess. Now, does that mean your race won't affect your chances of getting in? Not necessarily. It just means your race won't be listed on a spreadsheet next to your LSAT score with a column called Boost Factor. It means your story might be read more closely. Your essays might carry a little bit more weight, and your zip code might quietly matter more than your GPA. And this applies to everybody, not just those from underrepresented backgrounds. Because now, instead of using race openly, schools are relying on proxies. And we'll break those down in detail later, but for now, understand this. The game hasn't stopped. The rules just got blurrier. And when we work with students, this is usually one of the first myths we have to bust. They think, oh, I'm not an underrepresented minority, so this doesn't affect me. Or affirmative action's over, so now it's all just GPA and LSAT. Wrong on both counts. The entire system has shifted. And if you don't understand how it works post-ruling, you could either underestimate your own opportunities or miss out on strategic ways to stand out. And one last thing, don't assume law schools have already figured it all out. They haven't. Many of them are still scrambling themselves, rewording their applications, tweaking their essay prompts, launching new programs, and holding meetings titled things like, "Can we still say that?" So no, the end of affirmative action isn't as clean as a gavel banging and everybody moving on. It's more like a giant legal fog rolling in, and your job is to stay visible. Now let's talk about the real power players in legal education. No, not US News, not the law school deans. I'm talking about the ABA, the American Bar Association. And if you're thinking, wait, aren't they the people who write the model rules of professional conduct that nobody actually reads? Yes, that's them, but they're also the reason your dream law school gets to exist. Here's the deal. In most states, if you want to sit for the bar exam after law school, you've got to graduate from a school that's ABA accredited. It's like a golden ticket. No accreditation, no bar exam, no license, no legal career. So even though the ABA doesn't directly admit students, it absolutely shapes how law schools behave. And that brings us to Standard 206, the ABA's diversity and inclusion requirement. This is not some vague mission statement buried in a brochure. It is an official accreditation standard, and it demands that law schools show a concrete commitment to creating a diverse student body, that they hire more diverse faculty, that they promote equity and inclusion in their curriculum, that they support diversity-focused student organizations, and generally make real efforts, not just gestures, toward racial, gender, and identity inclusion. In theory, sounds nice. In practice, it creates a massive tension with the Supreme Court ruling. Because while the court says you can't factor race in admissions, the ABA says make sure your student body is diverse or else. You see the problem, right? Now imagine you are an admissions dean trying to navigate that tension. One side threatens lawsuits. The other threatens your school's very existence. So, what do most law schools do? They try to thread the needle. They follow the letter of the law just closely enough while trying to meet the spirit of the ABA's expectations at the same time. It's like being told to throw a surprise party for your boss without using the word party, inviting anyone from work, or making noise. But it better be good or else you're fired. And to be clear, schools take this seriously because the consequences for messing up aren't small. If a school is found to be non-compliant with Standard 206, here's what can happen. They can be publicly censured, they can be put on probation, and in extreme cases, they can lose accreditation altogether. And when we help students apply to law school, we always explain this behind-the-scenes pressure. Because if you don't understand the incentives law schools are working under, none of their decisions make sense. Essay prompts feel random. Holistic review sounds like fluff, and scholarship offers can feel arbitrary. But once you realize they're stuck in a weird tug of war between the Supreme Court and the ABA, it all clicks. They're not trying to confuse you, they're trying to avoid getting sued and losing their accreditation. Good luck, right? But for you, the applicant, this is actually a massive opportunity because most people have no idea this is happening. They're just blindly sending in their apps and hoping for the best. But you're going to know how the game is being played. And the best part is, you don't have to pick a side. You just have to learn the rules and use them to your advantage. So let's dig into how this actually plays out in real life. Now, a group called the Pacific Legal Foundation filed a bunch of Freedom of Information requests with public law schools. Basically, they said, we would love to see what the ABA actually told you in your most recent accreditation review. And that's the kind of move that makes administrators sweat through their suits. They sent these requests to 50 public law schools, and 45 of them responded. The other 5 were probably on vacation. And what they got back was eye-opening. Let's break it down. 20 law schools were criticized by the ABA for not meeting diversity requirements. 25 schools were praised for going above and beyond. That praise included things like scholarships specifically designed to promote diversity, race-conscious pipeline programs, more on that in a minute, DEI task forces and faculty trainings, diversity statements baked into the curriculum, and LGBTQ+ student support groups. All of this came after the Supreme Court had ruled that race-based admissions was unconstitutional. So here's the real question. How are schools still getting praised or punished for diversity efforts when they're not even legally allowed to use race in admissions anymore? Spoiler, they've found other ways to show they care about diversity. They're not just checking the race box on the application anymore, but they are still checking for outcomes that just so happen to correlate with race. Some of these efforts are framed around access or equity or support for underserved communities. And look, I'm not judging the values here, I'm just showing you the mechanics. Because if you're applying to law school, this is what's going on behind the scenes while you're writing your personal statement and stressing over your LSAT score. So when we coach students through this process, we make sure they're not just focused on their materials, but we also help them understand what's going on inside the school's head behind the scenes. Because when you understand their incentives, you can tailor your application in a way that's actually persuasive. And most applicants don't know any of this. They're playing poker without realizing the dealer is also trying to keep their job. But now you know. So the next time someone tells you affirmative action is over, you'll understand what's really happening. The game didn't stop. It just changed shape. So let's get into exactly how the schools are pulling this off and what it means for your application. So if law schools can't use race in admissions anymore, but they're still being evaluated, and sometimes rewarded for their diversity efforts, what exactly are they doing instead? Answer is, they're getting creative, and we're talking Ivy League level creativity. Because here's the reality. The goals of affirmative action did not go away, just the tools schools are allowed to use. So what are the new tools? I'm going to break down the 4 most common workarounds law schools are using right now. The first is pipeline programs. These are programs designed to attract and support applicants from underrepresented communities, especially those who might not have considered law school otherwise. They often start early, partnering with certain high schools or community colleges, offering LSAT prep and fee waivers, and providing mentorship, internships, and even guaranteed admission tracks. On paper, these programs focus on first-gen or underserved students, but the targeting often aligns closely with race and ethnicity. And to be clear, many of these programs do great work. They really do help close opportunity gaps, but you've got to understand them as a strategic part of the admissions landscape, not just feel-good side projects. And if you qualify for one, definitely apply. But if not, don't panic. This is just one of several levers the schools are using. The second is socioeconomic and geographic targeting. Law schools now look at where you're from and what conditions you grew up in, especially since they're not allowed to directly look at race. This includes low-income zip codes, high schools with low college-going rates, first-gen status, and rural or economically disadvantaged regions. Now, why does this matter? Because these factors often correlate with race, but aren't considered race under the law. So now, 2 applicants with identical LSAT scores and GPAs might be seen very differently based on their background data. One might come from a suburb where every kid takes the SAT with a private tutor. The other might have worked 2 jobs in high school and wrote their essay in a library without Wi-Fi. And that difference can help tip the scales. So when we work with students, we don't just ask for their stats, we dig into their story, because sometimes the biggest admissions advantage isn't your score, it's your context. Now, personal statements used to be a nice bonus, but now they matter a bit more because law schools cannot ask you about your race directly, but they can ask you to write about your background, life experience, and how your identity shaped your path. So what do? They prompt you to tell your story, and then they read between the lines. So you don't have to say, I'm Black, or I'm Hispanic, or I'm Native American. You just have to describe the experience of being you, and the admissions team can infer the rest. Now let's talk about diversity-focused scholarships. Many schools still offer these for students who've demonstrated a commitment to social justice, leadership in underserved communities, or overcoming adversity. That sounds broad, and it is. But again, these are coded ways to continue diversity efforts without triggering legal red flags. It's not about what they call the scholarship, it's about who they award it to. So if you've done work that fits those descriptions, community advocacy, legal aid internships, social justice organizing, this is your moment to shine. Now, none of these strategies explicitly break the law. They're not saying, we accept you because of your race. But the results? In many cases, they look remarkably similar to the outcomes of traditional affirmative action. And that's not a conspiracy. That is law schools doing what institutions always do when the rules change. They adapt. And your job is not to judge that. Your job is to understand it and then use it legally, ethically, and strategically to present the strongest version of yourself possible. Now let's talk about how all of this affects you no matter what your background is. If you are the pre-law student trying to get into a solid law school and maybe not take on 6 figures of debt in the process, it means your application is being read differently than it would have been just a few years ago. And you need to adjust your strategy accordingly regardless of your background. If you're Black, Hispanic, Native American, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, or multiracial, or you grew up in a context that people assume means affirmative action applied, here's what you need to know. You cannot rely on the checkbox anymore. It is gone. Even if you still see a box asking about race, it's legally meaningless in the admissions decision process. But that doesn't mean your story doesn't matter. Quite the opposite. Your story, the real story, is now your biggest advantage. This is where your personal statement and diversity statement become mission critical. Not fluff, not extras, mission critical. This is where you talk about your upbringing, your community, what obstacles you faced and overcame, and how those things shaped your values and drive. Think of it like this. You're no longer being pre-sorted by a checkbox. You now have to make the case for why your perspective matters using words, not forms. And that's a skill you can learn. When we work with students on their essays, this is where we often spend the most time, turning lived experience into strategic storytelling. Now, if you're not from one of these backgrounds, you might be thinking, well, what about me? If you're not first gen, if you didn't grow up low income, and your parents are lawyers, you're still in the game. But here's what you can't do. You can't coast on your numbers and assume that'll be enough. The playing field has changed. Now, more than ever, context and narrative matter. That means your job is to show why you want to study law, what makes your interest genuine and earned, and how you've demonstrated initiative, curiosity, and leadership in the real world. Schools are not looking for perfect robots with 180s and LinkedIn perfect resumes. They're looking for future attorneys with a point of view. So don't just say you want to make a difference, tell them what kind of difference and how. Regardless of your background, you are entering an application cycle where race can't be used, diversity still must be demonstrated, schools are under pressure from both legal and accreditation sides, and nobody fully knows what the new normal even is. Which means the best applicants right now are the ones who know how the game's being played. They understand what admissions is really looking for, and they craft their application to show value, context, and potential, not just stats. This is why two applicants with nearly identical LSATs and GPAs can have totally different outcomes. It's not luck, it's not politics, it's strategy. The old days of throwing out 15 different applications and hoping one sticks are over. In the new era, you want to have tailored, intentional, high application essays. So here's what we tell our students. You don't need to control the system, you just need to understand it better than the people who do. Because once you do, your application stops sounding generic. It becomes undeniable.